The car ride was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional whimper from the back seat. The pup, no older than a year, had her head down, eyes wide with uncertainty as she peered out the window. Her body trembled slightly, though she tried to stay as still as possible. Her coat was matted and dirty, her ribs visible through the thin layer of fur, and her tail was tucked so tightly it seemed like it might never move. Maggie, the woman driving, kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the pup as she squatted on the car seat. Her heart ached for the dog. She had read the pup's profile at the shelter just a few hours ago. Sweet girl, a little shy, recovering from trauma. Maggie could tell already that shy was an understatement. The pup looked like a deer caught in headlights, fearful and withdrawn, like she didn't understand what was happening or what was expected of her. When they arrived at the house, Maggie pulled into the driveway, turning off the engine and exhaling deeply. She got out of the car and opened the back door, crouching down to gently coax the pup out. "Come on, sweetheart," Maggie said softly, holding her hand out. "You're safe now. Let's get you inside." The pup's eyes darted to Maggie's hand, and for a long moment she didn't move. Then finally her paws shifted and she scrambled out of the car, keeping herself low to the ground. She didn't make eye contact with Maggie, her head angled downward in submission. Maggie's heart tightened. "You're okay," Maggie whispered, rubbing the dog's back gently. The pup flinched at first, then relaxed slightly as Maggie's fingers made contact with her fur. She was so fragile, physically and emotionally. But Maggie wasn't about to rush this. She knew that it was going to take time. It always did with dogs who had suffered. Inside the house, Maggie led the pup to the quiet corner she had prepared. A dog bed with soft blankets, bowls of food and water, and a few chew toys scattered nearby. The space was away from the chaos of her home, giving the pup a chance to adjust without feeling overwhelmed. "I'm going to leave you to settle in, okay?" Maggie said, her voice soft but firm. "You can take your time." The dog didn't seem to register the words, but she did curl up in the corner, shying away from Maggie's movements. Maggie stepped back, giving her space. Over the next few hours, Maggie checked in every so often, but each time the pup remained curled up, her eyes barely leaving Maggie's figure. Maggie had a hard time sitting still. She wanted to rush over and scoop the pup up in her arms, reassure her with touch, but she knew better. The last thing this anxious pup needed was to be overwhelmed. She needed patience. Slowly, gradually, Maggie could work to earn the pup's trust. By evening, the pup had started to move around a little more. She sniffed the food bowl, but didn't eat. She licked the water, but barely drank. Maggie didn't push it. She simply watched from the doorway, trying to be a calm, reassuring presence. When the pup eventually made eye contact with Maggie, her heart soared. It was a small moment, but it was significant. That night, Maggie lay in bed, thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. She'd fostered other dogs before, but this one felt different. There was a tenderness to her, a fragility that tugged at Maggie's heart, and she was determined to do everything she could to help her heal, no matter how long it took. The following morning was cool and crisp, and the air smelled fresh with the hint of rain. The pup, now named Willow by Maggie, had started to show some signs of curiosity. When Maggie went into the kitchen to prepare her coffee, Willow watched from the corner of the room, her eyes peeking out from behind the cushions of her bed. Maggie had already learned to keep the house quiet and calm in the mornings. No loud noises, no sudden movements. Willow was still adjusting, and Maggie knew that she needed to create a predictable routine. After a few minutes, Maggie slowly approached, Willow crouching down to her level. She held out a treat, a small piece of turkey that she had set aside for training. "I have something for you," Maggie said softly, her voice gentle. Willow's ears flicked back at the sound of Maggie's voice, and she took a small step backward. But she didn't run. She didn't bolt. It was a small victory, and Maggie smiled to herself. She was beginning to understand Willow's limits, and that was crucial. The next step was making sure Willow understood that there was nothing to fear in her new home. Maggie placed the treat on the ground and sat back. She didn't try to reach for it or force Willow to take it. She simply waited, her gaze warm but patient. Minutes passed, and Willow stayed in her corner, watching the treat but not moving. Maggie didn't rush her. She allowed the silence to stretch, knowing that trust couldn't be forced. Finally, after a long pause, Willow took a tentative step forward, her eyes flickering nervously between the treat and Maggie. She sniffed it, her nose twitching, then cautiously took it in her mouth. Maggie's heart swelled with pride. It was just a small step, but it was the beginning of something bigger. Willow had shown that she could trust Maggie to provide something positive, a small reward, and that was a breakthrough. "I'm so proud of you," Maggie whispered. Willow chewed the treat slowly, glancing back at Maggie with a flicker of uncertainty but not retreating. Maggie didn't push her, but she took a mental note. Today was the first day of progress. It was going to take time, lots of time, but Willow was starting to understand that this house, this person, could be trusted. The next few days passed quietly, with small victories scattered in between moments of uncertainty. Maggie kept her routine steady, allowing Willow the time she needed to adjust. She learned that even the slightest change in routine, a sudden noise or too much excitement, could set Willow back. But slowly, Willow started to show more interest in her surroundings. She spent a little more time out of her bed, sniffing the house with a tentative curiosity. Maggie didn't rush her. She simply allowed Willow to explore on her own terms, watching closely for any signs of stress. One morning, after she finished her coffee, Maggie opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The fresh air filled her lungs as she gazed out at the garden, where wildflowers were starting to bloom. The sun was soft, and the temperature was warming up. Willow had been staying close to the door for the past few days, but Maggie hadn't dared to push her too far outside. Today, though, she felt like it was time to try something different. "Come on, Willow," Maggie said softly, turning to look back at her. Willow was sitting in the doorway, watching her with wide eyes. "It's a nice day out. You don't have to go far, just a little bit." Willow's ears flicked back, but she didn't retreat. Maggie crouched down, a little further from the door than usual, and held out her hand in a calm, inviting gesture. "Just a little step," Maggie encouraged. Willow's gaze flickered between Maggie's outstretched hand and the small patch of grass just outside the door. She was hesitant, and Maggie could see the internal struggle written all over her face. But there was something else there now, too, a glimmer of curiosity, maybe even a spark of hope. Minutes passed, and Maggie stayed still, giving Willow the space she needed. Slowly, with a tentative movement, Willow stepped out onto the porch. Her paws made soft contact with the ground and she froze. Maggie held her breath, waiting. Willow didn't move for what seemed like an eternity, but her eyes were locked on Maggie, as though searching for reassurance. "You're doing great," Maggie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe here." Another long moment passed, and then, as if convinced that nothing bad would happen, Willow took another step forward. She sniffed the air, her tail lowering a fraction of an inch. Maggie watched her with a quiet smile, her heart racing with pride. Willow was trusting her. Slowly but surely, she was starting to trust the world around her again. Maggie continued to speak in soothing tones, giving Willow time to adjust to the outside. The two of them remained out there for only 10 minutes, just enough for Willow to feel the warmth of the sun and hear the birds calling from the trees, but it was an important step, a small victory that would lead to bigger things. That evening, Maggie gave Willow a little extra attention, petting her slowly while speaking in soft, reassuring words. Willow had come a long way in a short time, but Maggie knew that the journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun, but it didn't matter. Maggie was committed to Willow's healing. She'd seen the glimmer of hope in her eyes that morning, and it was enough to keep her going. It was a sign that the bond between them was forming. And though it might take time, patience, and countless small steps, Willow was on the road to recovery. The following week, Maggie continued to gently push Willow out of her comfort zone, little by little. She tried to introduce new sounds, new sights, and even new people, always careful to gauge Willow's reaction. If she seemed stressed or unsure, Maggie would back off and give her space. But if Willow was ready for the next challenge, Maggie would offer gentle encouragement, always keeping the pace slow and steady. One day, Maggie decided to take Willow for a short walk down the quiet street. She hadn't dared to walk her on a leash before, but today felt different. Willow had been growing more comfortable with being outside, and Maggie could see her excitement as the leash was attached to her collar. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible wag of her tail. "We'll take it slow," Maggie said, looking into Willow's wide eyes. "If you need a break, we'll stop. You're in control." Willow hesitated for a few moments, her body tense, but eventually she took a hesitant step forward. Maggie's heart soared. As they walked down the street, Willow remained close to Maggie, her ears alert and her eyes darting at every new sound. But Maggie noticed something different. There was a softness in her movements, a little less tension than before. She wasn't as rigid. There was a small sense of curiosity, a willingness to explore, and most importantly, she was following Maggie's lead. When they reached the park, Maggie stopped to let Willow sniff the air, giving her time to absorb her surroundings. Willow, though still a little cautious, took in the scents of the grass and the distant sounds of children playing. She seemed to relax just a little. Maggie crouched down beside her, rubbing the pup's ears gently. "You did great today," she said. "I'm so proud of you." Willow glanced up at her, her eyes softening slightly. There was still a distance between them, a faint trace of fear. But Maggie could see the change. It was subtle, but it was there. The walk home was quieter. Willow moved with more confidence now, her steps more fluid. She even glanced up at Maggie once or twice, as though she was checking in, making sure she was still there. When they returned home, Maggie offered Willow a treat, another small victory. The dog took it without hesitation, her tail wagging just a little faster this time. As the weeks passed, these moments of progress accumulated. There were still setbacks, still moments when Willow would shrink back into her shell. But there were more moments of connection, too. More moments when she would look to Maggie with trust, when she would nudge her hand for attention, when she would rest her head on Maggie's lap and close her eyes. They were a team now, and no matter how long it took, Maggie knew one thing for certain: she would never give up on Willow. She would continue to be patient, continue to encourage her, and continue to show her that the world wasn't such a scary place after all. It was late afternoon when the first real sign of Willow's full trust came. Maggie was sitting on the couch, reading a book with her feet tucked beneath a warm blanket. Willow had spent the last half hour lying near her feet, watching quietly from the rug. Every now and then, Maggie would look down to catch her gaze, and Willow would hold it for a few seconds before looking away, her ears twitching at the slightest noise. For the most part, Willow had been content with staying close. She didn't seem to want to leave Maggie's side for long, and Maggie was more than happy to have her there. Still, Maggie could sense the little moments of unease, the hesitant movements when Willow heard a sudden sound outside or saw a shadow flicker past the window. But today, there was something different. Maggie had left the door to the back porch cracked open just slightly, letting in the cool evening air, and as she glanced up from her book, she saw Willow standing, watching the space between the door and the threshold. Her eyes were fixed on the small patch of grass outside, and there was no fear in her posture, no tension. For the first time in a while, Willow was standing still, her body calm but alert. Maggie quietly put her book down and leaned forward. "Do you want to go outside?" she asked, her voice soft and reassuring. Willow didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back into her usual space by the door. Instead, she took a step forward, moving toward the open door, her tail held low, but the tip wagging just a little. It was subtle, but Maggie didn't miss it. She could feel her heart racing with excitement. This was the first time Willow was actively approaching the door, without hesitation, without fear of what lay beyond it. Maggie's voice was still calm, almost a whisper as she spoke. "It's okay. Let's go see what's out there." Willow's eyes flickered to Maggie briefly, and then, as though making a decision, she took another step forward. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as Willow crossed the threshold, stepping out onto the porch and then into the yard. Willow stopped as soon as her paws touched the grass, as though waiting for something to go wrong. But Maggie didn't rush her. She just stood in the doorway, watching quietly. Willow's gaze drifted from the grass to Maggie, who gave a soft nod, letting her know it was okay. Slowly, tentatively, Willow began to explore. She sniffed at the grass, the wind tugging at her fur. Maggie could see the tiniest twitch of her tail. She was hesitant but curious, each new step a brave one. This was huge. It wasn't just about the outside world. It was about Willow's courage to take the first steps toward independence, toward reclaiming what had been taken from her so long ago. Maggie took a few steps forward, just enough to show Willow she was still there, but she didn't crowd her. Instead, she let Willow have this moment. The pup sniffed the air, moving toward the flower bed, gingerly pawing at the soil. Maggie smiled softly. This was the beginning of something new. For the first time in days, Willow didn't seem like she was tiptoeing around the unknown. She was embracing it, if only for a few seconds. And that was enough for now. After a few minutes, Willow came back to Maggie's side. She didn't retreat, but instead she leaned against Maggie's legs, a small sigh escaping her as she sat down, content. Maggie crouched down, reaching out a hand to gently pet Willow's head. The touch was still tentative, but there was no hesitation this time, no nervous flinch. Willow closed her eyes, letting out a soft, contented sigh. "You did great," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." The connection they shared in that moment was undeniable. It was more than just a step forward in Willow's recovery. It was a bridge between them, built with trust, patience, and love. There was still so much to work through, but today Willow had taken another small step toward healing. The following week was filled with more progress. Willow began to venture outside more often, sometimes lingering in the yard, other times following Maggie down the sidewalk. For a short walk, each time her confidence grew just a little. Maggie kept the sessions brief, always watching for signs of stress, but as time passed, Willow began to show more comfort with her new world. One morning, Maggie decided it was time for another step forward. She'd been reading a lot about socializing, dogs, especially rescue dogs like Willow, and knew that meeting new people would be an important part of the process. While she had made sure Willow felt safe in her home, she knew that eventually Willow would need to interact with others. Maggie, who called her friend Sarah, who had visited the house a few times before but had always kept her distance from Willow. Today, she'd be the one to take the next step. "Hey, Sarah," Maggie greeted her when she picked up the phone. "Would you mind coming over today? I think Willow's ready for a new friend." "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice warm and upbeat. "I've been so excited to meet her. I'll be there in an hour." Maggie hung up and looked over at Willow, who was lying in her usual spot by the window, watching the world outside. Her tail thumped against the floor when Maggie spoke, though the pup didn't turn her head. "I think you're going to like Sarah," Maggie said with a smile. "She's kind and patient, just like me." When Sarah arrived, Maggie took a deep breath. Willow was already standing by the door, ears perked and eyes alert. Maggie motioned for Sarah to come in slowly, and they both kept their distance from Willow at first, letting her approach at her own pace. "Hi, Willow," Sarah said in a soft voice, kneeling down just a few feet away, her posture relaxed and non-threatening. "I've heard so much about you." Willow didn't immediately approach, but she didn't retreat either. Her eyes flicked back and forth between Sarah and Maggie. Sarah smiled gently and remained still, letting Willow take the lead. It took a few minutes, but eventually Willow took a few hesitant steps forward. She sniffed the air, then tentatively approached Sarah's outstretched hand. Maggie held her breath, watching carefully, and then slowly Willow allowed Sarah to pet her, a soft, trusting gesture that made Maggie's heart swell. It wasn't much, but it was a monumental step forward for the pup, one that Maggie would cherish for a long time. "You're doing great," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with pride. That night, after Sarah left, Maggie sat down beside Willow, who had curled up on her favorite spot by the couch. Willow looked up at Maggie, and for the first time, Maggie saw something new in her eyes. A quiet confidence, a sense of belonging. Maggie reached out and gently stroked Willow's fur. "You're not alone anymore. You've got this, Willow. You've got me." And as Willow nestled closer to her, Maggie knew that their journey together wasn't just about healing. It was about building a life of trust, patience, and love, one step at a time. The weeks seemed to blur together in a soft, steady rhythm of healing. Each day, Maggie and Willow found new routines to settle into, new patterns of trust to develop. The outside world, once a terrifying and unpredictable place for Willow, was becoming a little more familiar, and Maggie's home had become a sanctuary. The quiet days were no longer filled with tension. Instead, there was a sense of peace, a kind of tentative hope that Willow had begun to embrace. Maggie had taken to waking up earlier each morning, giving Willow time to adjust to the change of day. She had learned that Willow did best with small, manageable steps. Things like eating breakfast on the porch or sitting outside for a while before beginning the day's walk. Each time Willow showed her trust, Maggie felt a sense of triumph in her heart. They were both learning in ways neither of them could have anticipated. One Saturday afternoon, Maggie decided to take Willow to a nearby park. It had been a long time since the two of them had ventured further than their neighborhood, and Maggie could see the change in Willow's demeanor. She seemed more confident in herself, more willing to explore new things. Maggie's heart swelled as she strapped the leash to Willow's collar and gave her a reassuring pat on the head. "You're ready for this," she whispered, her eyes meeting Willow's. Willow's tail wagged slightly as she glanced up at Maggie, as though reading her emotions. Slowly, they stepped out the door and began their walk to the park, the air crisp with the scent of late autumn. Willow walked a little ahead, still cautious but less afraid. The sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, cars passing, distant. Conversations no longer made her freeze. Instead, she moved through it all with measured steps, occasionally glancing up at Maggie to check in. The park was bustling with activity. Families played catch, couples strolled hand in hand, and a few children ran past with kites soaring in the breeze. Maggie kept Willow close, mindful of the other people and the sudden sounds that could still startle her. Willow's eyes were wide, her body stiff at first, but she seemed curious, taking in everything around her. They walked to a quiet corner of the park where the trees offered shade and the grass stretched out in front of them. Maggie stopped to let Willow take it all in. "Go ahead," Maggie encouraged. "You're safe here." Willow hesitated for a moment, then slowly stepped forward, sniffing the grass beneath her paws. Maggie stood back, watching quietly. After a few minutes, Willow ventured further, circling the area as if she were marking her territory. Maggie's heart fluttered at the sight. This was another step, another breakthrough. After a while, they sat together on a nearby bench, taking in the view. Willow rested her head on Maggie's knee, her eyes slowly closing as the sounds of the park drifted past them. "You're doing so well," Maggie said softly, her hand resting gently on Willow's head. "I'm so proud of you." It was moments like this that Maggie cherished the most, the quiet, everyday moments when the bond between them deepened. It wasn't just about Willow's recovery, it was about their shared journey, about building a life together after all the struggles and scars. The following week brought an unexpected challenge. Maggie had noticed Willow becoming more protective of their home, barking when someone walked too close to the yard or when a stranger's car parked in front of the house. While this wasn't entirely surprising, it marked a shift in Willow's behavior. It wasn't an aggressive bark, more of a warning, as if Willow was saying, "I'm here and I'm going to protect this space." Maggie, though, wasn't sure how to handle it. She wanted Willow to feel safe, but she also needed to ensure she didn't become too territorial or defensive around people. One afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up in front of the house. Willow immediately stiffened and let out a sharp bark, then another, her ears flat against her head. Maggie stepped into the hallway, her brow furrowed. Willow's body was tense, her posture alert, and the growl in her throat was soft but insistent. "Willow, come here," Maggie called, her voice calm but firm. At first, Willow didn't respond. She was focused on the delivery person, her eyes never leaving the front yard. Maggie took a few steps toward her, her hand extended. "Willow," she said again, gentler this time. "It's okay." The pup paused, her head tilted to the side as if she were trying to process Maggie's words. Slowly, she looked up at her, still unsure, but beginning to calm. Maggie knelt down beside Willow, keeping her voice low and reassuring. "I know you're just trying to protect us, but we don't need to be scared. I'm here and I trust people." It took a few more minutes, but eventually Willow settled down. Maggie remained by her side, petting her gently, waiting for the tension to ease. When the delivery person finished and got back in the truck, Willow's posture softened, her tail relaxing at her side. "That's it," Maggie whispered. "You did great. We're safe together." It wasn't perfect. Willow hadn't fully let go of the instinct to protect, but the fact that she had listened to Maggie's voice, that she had chosen to trust her, felt like a victory. It was a lesson in patience, one that Maggie would need to reinforce again and again. That evening, after the delivery truck had gone, Maggie decided to take Willow for a walk around the neighborhood to help her shake off the last remnants of tension. They walked in silence, with Willow's tail wagging a little more with each step. "You're learning to trust me more," Maggie murmured, her hand resting gently on Willow's back. "We'll take this one day at a time, together." A few weeks later, Maggie decided to visit the shelter again. She had promised herself that she would stay in touch with the organization that had rescued Willow, and she wanted to check in on some of the other dogs. She also wanted to see if any new dogs needed fostering. It was a place that had been pivotal in Willow's journey, and it felt important to show her pup how far she had come. When they arrived, Willow was hesitant at first, her body stiff as they walked through the shelter's door. The smells of dozens of dogs, the sounds of barking in the distance, were overwhelming. But Maggie kept her hand steady on Willow's back, letting her know it was safe. Willow didn't interact with any of the other dogs that day. She stayed close to Maggie, walking alongside her as they toured the shelter. Maggie paused in front of one cage, where a small, scruffy dog was sitting, eyes wide with fear. "This little one's new," the shelter worker said. "We're still working on her trust. She's scared of everything right now." Maggie nodded, understanding. She looked down at Willow, who was sitting quietly at her side, ears perked. "You know what it's like," Maggie said softly to Willow. "You've been there." Willow didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. She just stayed by, Maggie's side, watching the other dogs with a quiet curiosity. As they left the shelter that day, Maggie couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd both come. It had been a long, sometimes difficult road, but Willow had blossomed in ways Maggie could never have imagined. "Look at you," Maggie said quietly, her voice filled with affection. "You're amazing. You've come so far." Willow wagged, her tail softly as they made their way back home, the world no longer so full of fear. They were moving forward together, one step at a time, one day at a time. The sun was setting earlier now, the days growing shorter with the coming of winter. The chill in the air had settled into a persistent presence. But inside Maggie's home, the warmth was always constant. The soft hum of the heater, the crackling of the fireplace, and the quiet rhythm of life with Willow had created a peaceful environment. And yet, there was a part of Maggie that knew they were not yet done with the healing process. While Willow had made incredible strides, there were still pieces of her past that lingered, some that Maggie couldn't reach on her own. This particular evening, as Maggie sat on the couch with her cup of tea, she looked down at Willow, who was curled up beside her. The dog's eyes were closed, her body relaxed, but her breathing was still quick and shallow. Maggie gently reached down to stroke her back, feeling the tense muscles beneath the fur. "You've come so far," Maggie whispered softly. "But I know it's still hard sometimes." There had been moments over the past few weeks when Willow's anxiety had resurfaced, flickers of her past fears showing up in brief, unsettling bursts. There were times when she would wake suddenly, her body stiff with terror, as if some phantom memory had taken hold of her. Maggie had learned to handle these moments with care, speaking calmly, offering comfort, and waiting for Willow to calm herself. And there were other moments, rare but growing in frequency, when Willow had shown flashes of the dog Maggie had hoped she would become. There was a spark in her eyes that spoke of trust, of a quiet joy that came from knowing she was loved and safe. But even with that progress, Maggie knew that there was still work to do. It wasn't a straight path after all. Healing was messy, winding, and unpredictable. That evening, Maggie decided it was time for something more, a kind of challenge. Willow had grown used to the neighborhood and the yard, but Maggie wanted to see how she would respond to something new, something a bit more demanding. It was time to visit the local dog park. At first, Maggie hesitated. Willow was still skittish around unfamiliar dogs, still nervous when too many people crowded the space. But something in Maggie told her that this was a good opportunity for Willow to expand her boundaries. If they could take things slow, if Maggie could help Willow stay calm, it might be a huge step forward. She stood up from the couch and walked over to where Willow was lying, her head resting on her paws. Willow raised her head as Maggie approached, her eyes soft but wary. Maggie crouched down, meeting her gaze. "How about we try something new today, girl?" Maggie said gently, her voice calm. "We're going to go somewhere different, but you're not alone. I'll be with you the whole time." Willow's tail gave a small, hesitant wag, and Maggie's heart swelled. There was still a wariness in her, but it was tempered by the trust she had in Maggie. Maggie reached for the leash, fastening it gently to Willow's collar. She kept the motion slow and steady, never rushing. Then she led Willow to the door. The walk to the dog park was only a few blocks away, but for Willow, it might as well have been miles. When they arrived at the park, Maggie felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. The park was lively, dogs running, playing, barking in the distance. There were a few families with children, people sitting on benches, some strolling along the paths. Willow tensed beside her, her ears flattened as she took in the activity. Maggie paused at the entrance, looking down at Willow, who was still standing still, her body rigid. "We'll just go in for a little while," Maggie reassured her, her voice soft. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. We can leave if it gets too much." Willow's eyes flickered up at Maggie, and for a moment it seemed like she was considering. The world around them was overwhelming, but she didn't shrink away. Slowly, as though making the decision herself, Willow stepped forward, her leash tugging slightly as Maggie followed her lead. They walked along the outer edge of the park, keeping their distance from the other dogs for now. The noise still unsettled Willow, but she kept moving, sniffing the air, and occasionally glancing up at Maggie. She was still on edge, but Maggie could see the beginning of a shift. Willow was no longer frozen in place. She was moving, adjusting, even if just a little. As they continued, they found a quieter corner where fewer dogs were playing. Maggie sat on a bench, and Willow sat beside her, her body still, but her eyes scanning the area. "You're doing so well," Maggie murmured as she gently stroked Willow's back. "You're not running away, that's huge." But Willow's calm didn't last long. A dog barked in the distance, sharp and sudden, and Willow's body tensed. She let out a low growl, her posture shifting as her anxiety returned. Maggie immediately noticed the shift and stayed calm. She kept her voice gentle, her movements slow. "Hey, Willow," Maggie said softly. "It's okay. It's just a sound. You're safe." Willow's breathing quickened, but Maggie didn't rush her. She kept her hand on the dog's back, grounding her in the moment. Slowly, the tension in Willow's body began to ease, but she didn't relax completely. A few minutes later, a small group of dogs came running toward them, tails wagging, barking playfully. Maggie held her breath as Willow stood up, her body tense and alert. This was it, the real test. Would Willow react with fear, or would she stay grounded? The first dog came a little too close, and Willow snapped, a sharp bark escaping her lips. Maggie was quick, gently tugging on the leash and guiding Willow a few steps back. She crouched down to Willow's level, her voice soft and steady. "Hey, it's okay, we're okay. Just breathe." The moment passed quickly, and Willow settled down, her breathing slowly returning to normal. Maggie kept talking to her, offering reassurance in a steady stream, letting Willow know that she was in control of the situation. After a few more minutes, the dogs moved on, and Willow relaxed again, her tail drooping slightly. "I know that was hard," Maggie whispered. "But you handled it, you didn't panic." Maggie stood up after a while and began walking with Willow back toward the park entrance, ready to leave for the day. Willow followed, her steps hesitant, but a little more assured than before. They had spent time in the park, and while it hadn't been perfect, it had been a valuable experience for them both. Willow had faced something difficult and had come through it without retreating. That, Maggie thought, was a huge success. As they made their way home, Maggie reflected on what had just happened. Willow hadn't been entirely calm, but that wasn't the point. She had taken the step. She had walked into the unknown, just as she had done with Maggie many times before. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about progress. And Maggie knew that progress, however small, was what truly mattered. When they got home, Willow immediately lay down by the front door, her body still on edge, but her breathing slowly returning to its normal rhythm. Maggie joined her on the floor, sitting beside her and offering gentle strokes along her back. "You're amazing," Maggie said softly. "You did so well. I'm so proud of you." And as Willow nestled closer, her body relaxing into the safety of Maggie's arms, Maggie realized that they were both healing together. Winter had settled in with its full force. Snowflakes drifted down in soft layers, blanketing the earth in a crisp, white silence. The air was colder now, biting even when the sun tried to break through the clouds. Maggie wrapped herself in layers of warmth, her boots crunching through the snow as she stepped outside to take Willow for their morning walk. The world felt still, as if nature itself had paused to breathe. Willow, however, seemed uneasy. She had been skittish lately, more sensitive to sounds and movements outside the house. Maggie had noticed it over the past few days. Willow's sudden starts at a passing car, her tense posture at the creak of a door. It wasn't just the usual anxiety, it was something deeper, something more internal. Maggie paused before stepping outside, giving Willow a moment to adjust. The dog stood. In the hallway, her tail tucked slightly, ears alert. She hadn't moved. "Hey, Willow," Maggie said gently. She crouched down, her voice soft, coaxing. "It's okay. We're just going for a walk. You're safe here." Willow's eyes flickered toward Maggie, the slight tension in her body still there. But the soft reassurance in Maggie's voice seemed to ground her. Slowly, Willow took a few steps forward, though she remained cautious, almost hesitant. Maggie smiled, pleased by the tiny step forward. Outside, the world was eerily quiet, the snow muffling the usual sounds of traffic and voices. The path they walked on was nearly empty. Few had ventured out this early. The wind whipped the snow into swirling patterns around them, but the only thing Willow focused on was Maggie, her eyes glued to her like an anchor. The walk started off. Slowly, with Willow's movements stiff and cautious, every sound seeming to startle her. Maggie's heart clenched, watching the familiar signs of anxiety take hold. She'd been through this before, of course, but something about the chill in the air made it feel more intense. "You're okay," Maggie murmured again, bending to adjust the leash, offering comfort through touch. But then Willow froze. Her body tensed, her nose twitching. Maggie followed her gaze, her pulse quickening. A figure had appeared in the distance, a man walking along the same path, his large coat flapping in the wind. He was alone, but his presence seemed to make Willow's anxiety spike. Maggie took a steadying breath. "It's just someone walking by, Willow. We don't need to be scared." She tugged gently on the leash, signaling Willow to move forward, but the dog resisted, staying rooted to the spot, her tail low between her legs. "Hey, come on," Maggie said softly, trying to coax Willow along. But it was clear Willow wasn't ready to trust just yet. She had sensed something about the stranger, something that made her retreat into the safety of her own shell. Maggie sighed quietly, her breath visible in the cold air. She knew this wasn't an easy moment for Willow. She knew how deep the scars ran, how the fears sometimes erupted unexpectedly. She dropped to one knee, meeting Willow's gaze. "You don't have to be afraid, okay? I'm here, you're safe. We're just walking, that's all." Willow blinked, her eyes still wide with uncertainty, her body taut. Maggie waited, her fingers lightly stroking the fur on Willow's back, hoping that the calmness in her voice would reach her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Willow took a tentative step forward, then another. Slowly, at her own pace, she started moving toward the stranger, her gaze never leaving the man as they passed him by. Maggie held her breath, praying the moment would pass without incident. As they moved past the man, Willow stiffened but didn't react. Maggie exhaled slowly, relief flooding her. They made it a few paces before Willow seemed to relax slightly, her body no longer tense. "That's it," Maggie whispered, her voice full of pride. "You did it. You're getting stronger." Later that evening, after a quiet dinner and a warm fire, Maggie sat with Willow curled up beside her. The dog's body was calm now, though there was a lingering anxiety that still flickered in her eyes. The world outside had grown colder, the night deepening with a heavy stillness that seemed to mirror Willow's own inner struggle. Maggie knew that the storm inside Willow was far from over, but they were making progress. There were moments when it felt like they had reached an impasse, when the journey seemed too long, too difficult, but then there were breakthroughs, small and subtle, but real. Willow had come so far since the day Maggie had first brought her home, and yet Maggie knew that there would always be days like today where the weight of fear seemed too much to bear. "Tomorrow will be a better day," Maggie murmured, stroking Willow's fur. Willow lifted her head, her eyes searching Maggie's face, as though she were asking if it was true. Maggie met her gaze with a quiet smile. "You've come so far," she said softly, "and you'll keep going. one step at a time. Willow's tail gave a soft thump against the floor, and Maggie took that as a sign of comfort. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. Together they had faced the storm outside, and together they would weather the one inside. The next morning, the snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a blanket of white that sparkled in the weak sunlight. It was a new day, a new opportunity for healing. Willow stood by the door, her ears slightly perked as Maggie got ready for their walk. "This time, we'll take it slow," Maggie said, slipping the leash onto Willow's collar. "No rush. We'll go at your pace." And as they stepped out into the quiet world, Maggie felt the familiar tug of hope in her chest. It was a quiet, steady thing, the kind of hope that didn't shout or demand attention, but lingered in the small, everyday victories. She could already see the difference in Willow, how far she had come, how much she had learned to trust. It wasn't perfect, but Maggie knew that the journey wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. And that was something worth celebrating. It had been a year since Willow had first stepped over the threshold of Maggie's home. In that time, Maggie had watched a transformation unfold, slow, gradual, but undeniably real. The little anxious dog who once flinched at the slightest movement, who had hidden in corners or cringed at unfamiliar voices, had blossomed into a dog who sought comfort, who offered affection in her own quiet way, and who, most importantly, had learned to trust. Again, but it hadn't been easy. It had been full of challenges, setbacks, and moments where Maggie wondered if she was doing enough. There had been nights when Willow had trembled in fear for no apparent reason, and days when the anxiety seemed too deep to reach. Yet, with every step forward, no matter how small, Maggie saw the glimmer of something beautiful. A bond had formed between them, built on patience, compassion, and unconditional love. On this particular morning, Maggie stood at the window watching as the sun's rays began to rise, casting a soft light over the backyard. The snow had melted in most areas, revealing patches of green grass and a few scattered leaves from the trees. The world felt alive again, thawing from the winter chill. Willow was lying in her usual spot by the door, a quiet presence in the room, as though she had always belonged there. Maggie couldn't help but smile as she watched Willow. She had come so far. The dog's coat shone with health, her posture was confident, and there was a peacefulness in the way she held herself now. She no longer trembled at every sound. She no longer feared the world outside the door. She had learned to trust her new life, and with it, she had learned to trust Maggie completely. Maggie turned from the window and crouched down beside Willow, offering a soft, gentle touch to her fur. "We did it, girl," Maggie said, her voice full of emotion. "We made it through the storm. You're home now." Willow raised her head, her brown eyes meeting Maggie's. There was a softness there now, a quiet acceptance. Her tail gave a slight wag, and Maggie's heart swelled. It wasn't the full-throttle wag of a dog completely at ease, but it was something, a gesture of trust, of peace. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Willow didn't flinch. Maggie stood and went to answer it, her heart light. It was a neighbor, holding a package that had been left at their door. Maggie smiled, accepting the box with a polite thank you before closing the door and turning back to Willow. Willow had watched the entire exchange from her spot on the floor. She didn't shy away from the visitor, didn't retreat. She simply observed with curiosity the slight tension that once marked her every interaction with the world, now absent. It was a quiet, almost unremarkable moment, but it meant everything. It was proof of how far Willow had come. The healing process, while never perfect, had created a life where Willow could exist in peace. Maggie kneeled next to Willow, who now stretched her legs out in contentment, the soft sigh of a dog who had learned the beauty of stillness. Maggie stroked her back, slowly, rhythmically. "You're home, Willow. Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And you're safe. I'll always be here. It wasn't just Willow who had healed. Maggie had too. She had learned the art of patience, the power of love, and the importance of trust. It had taken time, but Maggie had come to understand that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and that journey was never linear. There were highs and lows, moments of doubt, and moments of joy. But in the end, there was peace, there was trust, and there was home. Maggie stood and grabbed the leash, preparing for their walk. Willow was already by the door, waiting with a quiet anticipation, her tail giving a few soft thumps against the floor. "Ready to go, girl?" Maggie asked with a smile. Willow's tail thumped again, a bit stronger this time. "Let's go," Maggie said, opening the door and stepping outside. Willow followed, her movements more confident than ever, a dog now fully capable of exploring the world outside with Maggie by her side. Together, they stepped into the world beyond the front door, knowing that no matter what came their way, they were stronger together.